If anything about mindful meditation sounds familiar, it's probably because you at one point studied Buddhism, or some form of New Agey branch based out of Buddhism. The interesting thing about Buddhism is much of it has been proven to be scientific, the parts that can actually be studied and have been embraced by the psychological community. One of the major problems with the philosophy of Buddhism is that it's also a religion, and some of the key tenets of the religion are based on unprovable concepts. The major one is the belief in reincarnation. Religious Buddhism's major concept is that we're in a continuous cycle of death and rebirth, and reality is suffering, as back in that time period, suffering was much more common than now, as was death. Upon eliminating our desires, we break the cycle and move on to a higher plane of no desire after death. Reality is an illusion, and the elimination of those desires break our illusion, and we reach a state called enlightenment, where we are at ultimate peace. For a skeptic, there are some major issues with this. There is zero evidence that reincarnation or a soul exists, and that reality is a complete illusion. Our perceptions are easily confused, but our methodology can overcome them. So mindful meditation eliminates those ideas and keeps all the verifiable parts. For the skeptic, if one can achieve what the Buddha called enlightenment, it is a temporary thing. For the skeptic, if one can achieve what the Buddha called enlightenment, it is a temporary thing to help one relax, rest, heal psychologically and physically, boost your immune system, and cultivate empathy. After that, you have to develop a plan to channel that empathy to actually do something with it. This requires desire. Then the cycle repeats. Leave enlightenment with your new plan and desire to do good. Being is great, but you actually have to do something too. After you have accomplished your goal or failed and learned experience, then return to enlightenment and regroup. Now you have the mental clarity to come up with a much better plan and analyze all the options that would have stressed you out. Otherwise, if everyone with the skill of self-awareness did stay in enlightenment mode, you would just have to be living in your own little world, feeling happy while the rest of the world goes to hell and doesn't improve. That was the biggest problem I had with Buddhism, just sitting around feeling good and waiting for death when released from this illusion of suffering. It is yet another death religion, just like all the others. As death approaches, I will certainly return to the enlightenment state for good, because it allows for peace in death and happiness, and a lack of fear, which is natural in all of us. But until that point comes, I want to make sure that I use my empathy to help others beyond a handout here and there. I lived out in the country homeschooled. We had one car, most of the time that my dad used. I had a lot of free time growing up and little socializing. Because of a combo of Asperger's and religion and a lot of reflective time, I was able to be very mindful to the point of depression because I could see all the bad in the world and didn't have a clue how to train my reflexive mind to actually do anything. I had a high appreciation of the world and great wonder about it. My brother always wondered how I could talk about, focus on, and see all the horribleness of the world and not go out and kill myself, because talking to me usually ended up depressing him. Unlike most people who are great at the doing, but not great at the being, I was the exact opposite. I ignored my beast and never utilized it, as the beast made me sin. Most people run via their beasts and rarely let the reflective mind do work other than possibly to beat up the inner beast. I wore out my reflective mind trying to be aware of everything and never let my inner beast do what it was there for. As I never got practice, it made doing anything more difficult than it should have been, and I wondered why my life was so much harder than anyone around me. Once I learned self-hypnosis and relaxation, I actually got in touch with my inner beast, and I was able to do twice as much, if not more, because I didn't have to be constantly mindful. Because of this weird combination, I took to Buddhism and what I believed to be enlightenment very easily. However, the empathy I felt and increased from it made me feel guilty for having the happiness that others couldn't have. When the Buddha first discovered enlightenment, he basically became dirt poor, and his followers did the same. They traveled around and stayed at people's houses and begged for food, and in exchange taught people spiritual teaching. In an age of high illiteracy, this was not a bad deal for the average laborer. However, the contentment experienced by enlightenment was caused by a position of privilege. Most of these laborers didn't have the time and energy to reach enlightenment. However, without these laborers, the monks couldn't actually live that lifestyle. It was probably the best system for the time, but sadly unfair, and we live in a system now where we all have access to information, and none of us can fairly live off the rest of the world and avoid stress. Think of life as a living reincarnation. Each time you discover or rediscover enlightenment, you're dying and being reborn, much like the Time Lord regeneration. At 25, I had ambitious plans to help the world, and I knew the only way to do so would be to get my degree at that time to increase my income from what I was making. It required me to leave my contentment behind and step out and deal with stress. I was happy. I could have lived the rest of my life content, but I saw the horrors of the world around me and knew I couldn't stand by and be the only one loving life. It's a lot like being in heaven while knowing others are in hell. Thanks to the economy, those plans were ruined, and in the process I discovered that I probably didn't have the skills needed for that particular plan. My main goal is to get out of student loan debt now and become financially stable again like I was before I decided to take on my plans. Now I'm working to return to my state of contentment so I can regroup my efforts and re-energize my sense of wonder and empathy. My reserves of these are a lot lower than they used to be. Neil deGrasse Tyson has repeated what so many have, that if a pill was given to extend life indefinitely, he would not take it. He feels his sense of wonder would be diminished, and his urgency that drives him to do great things would be depleted. I personally do not understand this concept. Death is not a driver for me. It's a depressor and creates nihilism and lethargy for me. Or it drives me to focus on dealing with the fear of death via meditation and acceptance, which makes me neutral in terms of drive. I haven't got to do so many things I want to do in life, mostly due to limited options and limited finances as well as a broad range of interests. Neil had a bullseye focus on what he loved. It was impossible for me to love just one field enough to do what he did. For the first time ever, death may be a choice in our lifetime, which scares a lot of people when you talk to them about it. All our ideas, religions, and philosophies focus on death and dealing with death. Most of them were founded back when our life expectancy was half of what it is today, and we didn't have a lot of time to think. They're sadly outdated, and I know so many teens that focus on death and have no sense of wonder because all of their philosophies are based around death, and they don't know how to enjoy life. We have twice the lifespan of the ancients, and accidental death is now a rare freak occurrence that we are still using these death philosophies with. I and many of the late teens and early 20s got massive depression because we'd readied ourselves for death and accepted it. It's not going to happen for another 60 years. I myself recommend a life philosophy and a death philosophy. The danger is when you're hooked on one and the other sneaks up on you, it causes you terrible fear because you don't have a philosophy to deal with it. Back when life was short and death was certain and often, focusing on death was very important. When I reach death, I will focus back on the philosophies of death to gain solace. What we need are philosophies of life now to drive us to become better people and make the world into a place where one would enjoy living in forever. I had that death philosophy most of my life, leading me to a lot of depression. I now have a level of wonder and excitement about my life, my opportunities, and what will be discovered. The more I know, the more I want to know, as new knowledge creates new questions. I am not driven by my sense of death, as that would just lead me to stress out, killing me much sooner, reducing what I would be capable of doing, with much more wisdom and better understanding. I'm driven to ensure that I'm worthy of a longer life, that I deserve the gift given me. The philosophy of life requires creating and maintaining wonder. That is what will keep you motivated and going, and we can prove how this occurs in the brain. Unless we all work to improve the system and take on some of the stress and desire of the world, others won't have the luxury to reduce their stress and desires. The cycle of enlightenment and mindful meditation seems to be the only true selfless form of Buddhism for a skeptic. Of course, some may say that it's not real Buddhism, but considering there's a branch that believes that the way to nirvana is through Christian-like faith in the Buddha, and he wrote down nothing and had 52 disciples that all started schools with different ideas, I'm going to say that that would be a no true Scotsman fallacy. Relaxation, emptiness, and peace are valuable, but also luxuries. Taking on the stresses of the world for a time is the only way to truly have what the Buddhists consider the most powerful force in the universe, empathy.